Failure is not an option. That is the refrain of those who look at the U.S. in Iraq and argue that the U.S. needs to stay the course. It's been more than 3 years since the Bush administration set out to depose the dictator Saddam Hussein and to eliminate what many thought was a serious WMD program, a campaign that has now cost the lives of thousands of American troops and tens of thousands of Iraqis who have taken to killing each other. Where the U.S. talked about planting a democracy, civil war may now loom. Failure is not an option, but what about victory? Is it attainable, and what defines it now? What constitutes success in Iraq? To stop the killing, to get U.S. troops home with honor, or just to get the lights back on, to get the power system up and running once and for all? The president says that history will be the judge, but we are living in the present and have to draw some lessons for today to figure out what we want to leave behind in Iraq and when. Coming up next on Great Decisions 2007.
In a democracy, agreement is not essential, but participation is. Join us as we discuss today's most critical global issues. Join us for Great Decisions. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association, inspiring Americans to learn more about the world.
Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Starr Foundation, the Morse Family Foundation, the William and Karen Tell Foundation, and U.S. Trust.
Now from our New York studios, here is John Donvan.
I'm John Donvan of ABC News, and welcome to Great Decisions. Joining me to discuss the lessons of Iraq are Larry Diamond, Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution and Stanford University, and author of Squandered Victory, The American Occupation, and the Bungled Effort to Bring Democracy to Iraq, and also Michael O'Hanlon, who is Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution and author of Hard Power, The New Politics of National Security. And Larry, we heard a series of questions in our introduction. Among them, implicitly, is the whole notion of the goal of bringing democracy to Iraq. And I know that you and I were in Iraq at the same time when you were actually out there as a theorist and practitioner. The whole purpose being to follow through on this program of teaching the Iraqis what democracy was, encouraging them to go ahead with it. And I want to know, in retrospect now, as well as looking forward to 2007, what are your hopes for the notion of democracy as any of us understanding it taking root in Iraq as it sits today?
Well, obviously, we all hope that Iraq can gradually become a more democratic, free, rule of law state. I think our goal of trying to build democracy in Iraq from the beginning has failed. I don't think Iraq is going to be anything like a democracy or a liberal state anytime soon. I think it's failed in significant measure, not exclusively because of the litany of mistakes that we've made. And I would just stress, John, that before you can have a democratic state, you have to have a state. You have to have political order. You have to have some minimum control of the territory by a political entity, a state that has a monopoly over the means of violence. And that has never existed in Iraq, and indeed we shattered the previous state without any plan in any kind of coherent way to substitute anything to fill the vacuum. And I think the seeds of the disaster that Iraq has been becoming since our, quote, victory in April of 2003 lie in that failure to secure the country and provide order and have enough troops to do so from the very beginning.
You just used the word disaster, the disaster that's coming. Mm-hmm. You stand by that wholly.
I think that Iraq is on its way to becoming the biggest disaster in the post-World War II history of the United States. And I think our goal at this point has to be to avoid that, to try to stabilize the country, to prevent the descent into all-out civil war, because through 2005 and 2006 it's been creeping into what I would call a medium-intensity civil war. You can't have people dying at the rate of 40,000 a year, civilians, and use any other term but civil war. So we have to try to walk the country back from that and fashion the political compromises and rebuild the state structures that can at least provide some degree of order, stability, and minimum political compromise in the country.
That's pretty bleak. Do you see it as bleakly?
Almost as bleak. I think it's worth clarifying that even if we don't get democracy, and we're not likely to get what we would feel comfortable calling a functioning democracy for a long time, I certainly agree with Larry on that, we could still have a passable outcome for the United States in a more traditional national security sense, in the sense that as long as Saddam and his sons are not thinking of building nuclear weapons, and they might have someday, even though we now realize they hadn't made any progress before the war, it could be a benefit to the region to have a more benign kind of regime, as long as it's not invading its neighbors, massacring its minorities, giving al-Qaeda refuge, or developing nuclear weapons. But even that set of more minimal goals is looking very hard to attain. And I think that was implicit or explicit in what Larry said. And I would say that even by that lower threshold for achieving a passable outcome, we are in serious jeopardy. It's not right to give up hope. I think we've got to keep at this for a substantial period of time. We've got to find some way to lower our sights and construct a policy that can shoot for a lower outcome if there is such a thing.
I mean, it's interesting that you're saying we have to lower our sights. In your book, one of the questions that you're raising is, was it worth it? And we're asking that question almost 4 years after the invasion. What does it say that 4 years after the invasion we're still wondering whether it was worth it?
Well, I'm afraid we're going to be wondering a lot more than 4 years. And in fact, if we stop wondering, it's a problem, because if we stop wondering, the verdict is going to be that it wasn't worth it. In other words, it's going to be very hard to imagine an outcome so clearly good that it will become an obvious argument that this war, despite its costs, was a net benefit for the United States. The best we can hope for is that this debate will continue for the rest of our lifetimes. The worst we can hope for is, or fear, is that it will become pretty obvious pretty soon that it was a mistake. And I think that's the basic lay of the land.
Excuse me, I think it's obvious now that it's a mistake. We've lost a number of Americans greater than what we lost on September 11th. We've spent hundreds of billions of dollars. The toll in terms of the net drain on the American economy over the lifetime of supporting the wounded veterans and paying off the debt is probably going to total $1 trillion. We've ground down the United States Armed Forces to the point where there's virtually nothing left to deploy if there should be an international crisis anywhere else in the world. We have made Iran and the most radical factions of the Iranian regime much more secure against any American deterrence, and therefore much bolder in seeking nuclear weapons. I just can't see, and Iraq has sunk into the level of instability it has, where now our goal, I think we agree, has to be some degree of stabilization. I just don't see
Didn't we have stabilization before the invasion, or a stable situation relative, at least compared to today?
I don't think it was, to use Michael's word, a benign form of stability. I don't challenge the argument that Saddam Hussein was a serious threat. I don't challenge the argument that if he didn't have weapons of mass destruction, at least he wanted them and would pursue them at the next opportunity. So was it stable and benign for the United States? No, but everything has to be weighed against the alternative. And I think if you go back, even now at this moment, historically, and weigh the counterfactual, we don't invade, we contain him, we get it right in Afghanistan in terms of putting the number of forces in Afghanistan we should have, so we wouldn't be in the process of losing Afghanistan as well, which we have been, and we put more diplomatic pressure and even implicit, not explicit, military pressure on Iran to get them to cease their nuclear weapons program. I think that counterfactual looks an awful lot better than what we've had.
One of the short-term debates in this country, as opposed to the long-term debates, future of Iraq, compartmentalized, is about military presence in the country, in Iraq, that is not very popular in this country. The question is it time to bring the troops home? Is the very fact that that conversation is taking place detrimental in the long term to the overall perception of the United States, the overall future of Iraq, that we're even talking about it? As natural as an impulse as it may be to want to get the troops home, is it something that it is safer for us to not be talking about in public?
I wouldn't say that. I think that's an argument we sometimes hear from the administration, although even they aren't quite so shameless as to argue that, even in their standard rhetoric. Sometimes they will, as a last resort, when the debate gets particularly pitched and partisan and nasty in the United States. But basically you're saying, should we suppress our own natural democratic ways and norms and the demands of a free society in order to project an image of resolve? Well, you got to give George Bush credit for one thing. He projects resolve pretty well. And my guess is most Iraqis have sensed that. They may think that we'll leave in 3 or 5 or 7 years, but it's not as if they think that because there's a little bit of a debate back home that we are therefore on the verge of withdrawing troops. John Kerry, despite making, I think, a number of mistakes in his 2004 presidential bid, at least projected resolve as well. And I think that's to his credit, that Americans recognize, to use the old phrase of John McCain that he used in regard to Kosovo, we're in it, we got to win it. Or at least we got to try real hard before we give up. And I think we've done a pretty good job as a country of projecting that. Unfortunately, for all the reasons Larry's been emphasizing, the weight of evidence suggests that we're on the verge of being at a point where we may have to concede this is headed in the wrong direction. But
which means doing what? Just leaving?
Well, I'm not advocating that, but I am saying it's becoming more reasonable, in my judgment, to make that pitch in a way that I don't think it was as reasonable the last 3 years. And most American politicians of major stature did not make that argument. So I just, in conclusion, find it hard to sustain the belief that we've projected indecisiveness. We've projected a fair amount of resolve, and it still hasn't been enough to make a difference.
And you think that resolve is very much tied up in the persona of the President of the United States?
Yeah, but also John Kerry, the main political opponent of George Bush during this period of time. Also people like Hillary Clinton, who are looming as the next potential Democratic candidates for president. There is not a real strong, and there has not been up until now, a real strong movement, except from the very leftmost elements of the Democratic Party. Some people in the Democratic Party, fairly enough, are saying, I was against this war, history is proving me right. But a lot of them still recognize that given where we are today, we need a fairly careful strategy for reducing our commitment.
Let me say that I suspect that Michael and I agree that we can't stay indefinitely and we can't get out within a year by some rapid and fixed timetable. And the reason why Iraq is different than Vietnam and therefore is more resistant to the simple declare victory and get out, or just get out and accept defeat and cut our losses, is because there is a threat directly to the national security of the United States and the safety of our homeland that is brewing, growing, and metastasizing in Iraq that is nothing like what we faced in Vietnam. The only dominoes left to fall when we got out in Vietnam were Cambodia and Laos, and they did, and it was all tragic, to be sure. And the loss of American lives in Vietnam was far greater than what we can even contemplate in Iraq. But we did not have in Vietnam brewing an organized terrorist infrastructure that was determined to and increasingly capable of attacking the United States and Europe. And that is what we have in Iraq, in western Iraq in particular, in Anbar province. It did not exist before. It is a creation of the mess that was generated by our intervention in Iraq and our failure to stabilize.
And Larry, you think that goes beyond a nationalist insurgency? You think its goals are...
Absolutely. It's well more than a nationalist insurgency. The nationalist insurgency of a secular nature we can deal with and should have been dealing with 3 years ago when they started knocking on the doors of people in the international community saying that they wanted to talk directly to the United States. Another opportunity that the Bush administration squandered. The jihadist elements who believe in a global war of Islamic struggle against the Western world, Europe and the United States, we can't talk to them. All we can do is try and divide the secular elements of the insurgency from the jihadist ones and make sure that the secular elements and the Iraqi tribes who want their country back, both from al-Qaeda infiltrators and from the United States, that they ultimately come out on top.
Is it your sense that the Iraqi government, however it's constituted, whoever is president from one time to another, is it your sense that it has any credibility among the Iraqi people, or is it tainted by association with the United States at this point?
I think that in general in Iraq, what you're seeing now is a splintering along sectarian and ethnic lines, and the worry that we would be essentially helping create a puppet or a stooge regime, that was a greater worry in the first couple of years. And if only we had just that worry today, in the sense that as 2006 has unfolded and we've moved, therefore, into the next phase of this, what we've seen is 2006 becoming the era, or the year of sectarian strife and of looming civil war. I think Larry's right. It's pretty hard to see the level of violence and call it anything but civil war in one sense. But in another sense, at least the politicians, the top-level politicians, have not been actively taking sides and encouraging violence. But things are moving in that direction one level below them. The militia leaders, many of the second-tier political leaders. And so I worry less about an Iraqi government being seen as too close to the United States. I worry more about it being unable to bring together the different factions. If they could bring themselves together to some extent at our expense and say, let's forge a common pact here, a common government. Let's agree on how to share oil. Let's agree on how to build a national army and police. And we don't like the United States. You guys got to go within a year, turn us into the scapegoat, but at least hold themselves together. I would almost welcome that in a sense, because the other danger is just all-out civil war.
Well, go ahead, Larry.
The problem is not so much that the Iraqi government is now seen as a stooge of the United States. The problem is that the Iraqi government is seen as feckless, incompetent, incapable of protecting people, and incapable of arresting the slide to civil war that is going deeper and deeper toward the abyss. And that's what Iraqis are despairing about. They are also suspicious of the United States and resentful of it and want it to leave because they think we have imperial intentions there. They think we want permanent military bases. They think we want to control their oil indefinitely. And one of the tragedies of our intervention in Iraq is that the Bush administration has not done some of the obvious things it could have done and could still do to mitigate these suspicions. For example, declaring unambiguously that we're not going to seek permanent military bases in Iraq.
And what about that? Do you think that the Iraqis are just being paranoid?
No, I think it has been an aim of the American intervention, not necessarily a preeminent one, but a corollary one, to have a base of power projection in the region. Mm-hmm. I don't even say that this is, in the abstract, an illogical or immoral thing if you're concerned about containing the spread of Iran's revolutionary influence and stabilizing the region. I just think it was a fantasy from the beginning to think that that ever would have been possible in Iraq, that any kind of democratic government in Iraq ever would have stood for that.
Michael, imagine for a moment you're 18, 19 years old, you're an Iraqi young man, and a poster goes up that they're recruiting for the Iraqi police force. Would you consider it? Would you sign up?
It's a tough call. It's a job. There aren't too many jobs in Iraq today. I think we should have had a public works jobs program designed in conjunction with the Iraqi government a long time ago. Not that that would have stopped the insurgency, but it would have given more people a number of options instead of taking $50 to fire an RPG at a passing American convoy. But at least the police do offer jobs. The casualty levels for the police are quite high. 200 to 300 Iraqi security personnel were killed per month over these last couple of years.
And are they respected?
Well, not so much. The police are not a very effective organization. In one sense, though, what the police are becoming is the Dr. Jekyll version of the militias. And often the same people are in the militias and in the police. And so in that sense, if you're an Iraqi, you can now view the police not as an institution that represents the future of this new country we're trying to build, but in a way as the reflection in your neighborhood of your own militia, your own sect, and a way to get some money while you also, wreak havoc by night when you put on a different uniform, or maybe you keep the same uniform and act in an irresponsible way anyhow. In other words, the police, it just isn't working. Regardless. And for some Iraqis, if they're 18 or 19, yeah, they'll join because they can make the money and still foment the violence they would have tried to contribute to anyway.
Let me ask Larry a slightly different question, particularly since you came out of this democracy work. If there is a non-governmental organization setting up in Iraq, for example, perhaps something to do with the media, it's got American brand on it, it's about democracy, et cetera, and a friend comes to you and says, hey, why don't you come over and join the group and we'll be doing some democracy work. Would you go? Would you sign up as an Iraqi? Because it could be pretty risky now.
I think a growing number of Iraqis are not. First of all, a lot of those people have left the country. We've got
out of fear, or
out of fear and despair. We have 500,000 to 1 million Iraqis who have fled. This is why real estate prices are booming in Amman and Damascus. I know a number of these civil society activists. Some are still struggling tremendously courageously and against great odds. Others have had their lives threatened so repeatedly.
These were the people that we. You used the word fantasy about. Okay, bet on. These were the very people that we wanted to stand up and speak out at the time of the invasion and afterwards to say, we believe in what you're doing. And now you're saying that they're paying a price.
Now I'm saying I think we have failed them very badly.
And they're gone.
I think a shocking number of them, shocking proportion of them, outside of Kurdistan, where they're still able to operate because there's much greater security there, have fled the country or are unable to operate in any kind of way that would be consistent with a civil society because the country is in such a state of violence and insecurity they can't move around and they can't organize.
Just one quick footnote on that. It's from the Iraq Index we do at Brookings. We try to track the number of physicians in Iraq and what's happened to them. And I'm just remembering the numbers vaguely, but of some 40,000 total physicians who were estimated to have been in Iraq in 2003, a couple thousand have been kidnapped or killed, and at least 10,000 have fled the country. So that's pretty obvious middle-class, upper-class flight. You can't afford that when you're trying to build a nation.
I'm hoping you can tell me at least that some of the reforms that the U.S. tried to put in place, again, from 2004 on, have stuck. For example, the school books have got to be different. That's got to have stuck. I mean, you can't put that genie back in the bottle, but am I correct that the kids are actually reading stuff in their school books that isn't nonsense and isn't about Saddam and his sons and the Ba'ath Party? That's stuck, right?
They're better. And the schools are relatively full from the last indicators I've seen as well. So that's one more hopeful trend.
Here's what I would say about the legacy in a positive sense. I think our goal now, I repeat, has to be to stabilize the country, to arrest the slide into full-scale civil war, and to broker some political compromise on the big issues that still divide the major sects and parties, the division of oil revenue, the federal structure of the country, and so on. I think that the country is going to be unstable, ridden with criminal and political violence for a long time, no matter what. But if you look down the road and say, what will we have accomplished looking back 20 years later, the best that I can realistically summon for you is that frequently when countries make transitions to democracy, they look back on periods where they tried to get democracy and failed, but at least there were the seeds of a model, the seeds of a set of principles, the seeds of a civil society organizing. And I do think someday Iraqis will look back on this experiment, draw some lessons, and draw some principles out of what they tried to do in these two constitutions.
So this is their Prague Spring, for example, you're saying?
I'm afraid it probably is.
But a far more violent one.
Yes.
How encouraged do you think you would be now in these acts of imagination, I'm asking you to be, if you were a young man on the side of the insurgency? Would you be thinking this is your golden age, putting aside the fact that martyrdom is its own reward?
There's another way to ask your question, John. Ask yourself, how will they react if we get out within a matter of months or a year, no matter what, fixed deadline, just get out, and al-Qaeda and the jihadists have firm control of western Iraq and are using it as a base of operations to organize for jihad against the West? They will consider it to be a great victory. It will stimulate their recruitment even far more, and it will be, in fact, a means for projecting terrorism into Europe and the United States. I have no doubt of that.
I want to ask one last question in about the 30 seconds we have. Little formulaic, but it has meaning. If we look ahead 5 years, we would be talking about Great Decisions 2012, which sounds like a very large number. Do you think we'll still be talking about the U.S. presence in Iraq at that point? Your guess?
Yes, at a small level, for all the reasons we've been discussing today. Despite the bad tone, the negative tone of this conversation, the alternative of losing is so much worse than the alternative of trying to salvage something that I wouldn't be surprised if we're still involved.
And Larry?
I think we'll have no more than a relatively modest number of troops there by then, if that. I don't think we're capable of sustaining anything like the level of military deployments that we have in Iraq now for more than another 2 years or so.
Larry Diamond, Michael O'Hanlon, thank you very much. I'm John Donovan, and thank you very much for joining us for Great Decisions 2007.
To learn more about topics discussed on Great Decisions, visit our website at www.greatdecisions.org. To order a copy of the Great Decisions Briefing Book, a DVD set of this series, or to join a Great Decisions discussion group in your area, contact the Foreign Policy Association. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Starr Foundation, the Morse Family Foundation, the William and Karen Tell Foundation, and U.S. Trust.